Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and give it just another moment or two before we get started. I see a lot of people coming in from the waiting room, and so we'll give you all just a moment to get in and get settled. Thank you so much for joining us on at least East Coast lunch break. I don't know if it is lunch break where you are, but we're appreciative that you want to use a little bit of your time today to learn more about the world around you and what you can do to continue to preserve it. So thank you so much for being here. Hello, everyone. Okay, it's 12:01, so we'll go ahead and get started, but I see people are still joining, so thank you for being here. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Allison Weiss. I'm the Associate Director of Corporate and Executive Education at the Brown University School of Professional Studies. Our mission at the Brown School of Professional Studies is to empower you with the tools and the frameworks that you need to change the way that work works for good. And that means that we are dedicated to meeting you where you're at and giving you the skills and the tools that you need at all stages in your career. So whether you are someone who is curious about a topic like this and you want to just pop in for a 1-hour class like this is today, or whether you want to build skills over a longer period of time, our portfolio of programming has something to offer for you on the most in-demand skills. So we hope that now that you've joined us today, you'll continue to check us out and that we can be your lifelong partner in your learning and career journey. And today I'm really excited to be able to welcome you to part 2 of 3 of our Science of Climate Change series. And today we're talking about zero emissions electricity. And this is, like I said, part 2 of 3. And the goal for all 3 of the courses is to make you feel empowered to make a difference today. And I know something our incredible faculty lead, Stephen Porter, has talked about is that, so often the literature out there about climate science can seem either incredibly daunting, incredibly difficult to parse out what's true and what's not, or hard to read if you're not someone who has a background in hard sciences. And the goal of these courses is to help you leave feeling not daunted, but empowered to make a difference. And so if you have a question at any point today, I encourage you to enter it when the question comes to mind. Don't wait till the end. If you look at the bottom bar of your Zoom, there is a section that says Q&A. Click on that button and submit your question there, and I'll be monitoring it throughout. And at the end, I will facilitate the question and answer section. So with that, I will introduce you to our amazing faculty member who's with us today, Dr. Stephen Porter. Dr. Stephen Porter is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology and a fellow in the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. And as if that wasn't enough jobs already, he's also the Associate Provost for Sustainability at Brown, which means he brings both the academic and research expertise to this talk and also his experience with actually putting it into practice, which I think is a really powerful combination. Thank you so much for leading us today, Dr. Stephen Porter, and I'll turn things over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Allison, and thank you all for joining us again, as Allison said, at least on the East Coast during lunchtime. And for those of you who are scattered around the world, thank you for making time, whatever time of day it is for you. I hope that you had a chance to watch the videos on zero emissions electricity, because that's going to be a jumping off point for this conversation to give you, but I will recap a bit of the main points in case you watched them a while ago or didn't get a chance to watch them. My goal here is to go about half an hour or so with a little bit of a lecture or a talk, I would say, and then open it up to questions and do my best to answer all of your questions. A little bit about me, just for context. I am trained as a global change scientist. My primary research at the beginning of my career was in tropical rainforests. And so Allison mentioned there'll be another video series coming up, and that one will be on deforestation. But over time, I got more and more interested in practical solutions to the climate problem that expanded beyond the basic sciences and expanded beyond tropical rainforests, which were my area of study. And so over time, I've developed expertise in a variety of things, including institutional so-called decarbonization, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from institutions, particularly universities, but others as well. And the videos that you watched are part of a course that I developed at Brown with the help of many here, to look at a multidisciplinary perspective on how we could solve this wicked problem of climate change. So today is going to be about electricity, but I will also draw in some building science into today and some thinking about transportation. But I'll point out that this course is meant to make us think about what a solution means to different people. So the solution to zero emissions electricity, for example, that might mean something different to an engineer than to a politician, right? There's a technical challenge associated with running our grid off solar panels, for example, but there's also a political and institutional and economic challenge to making that transition. And you can't succeed without the technology, but you also can't succeed without the political will. So we'll try to talk about both of these in today's conversation. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and Allison, if you can just confirm when I do that, that we are all seeing the right thing. Nope, now we're not seeing the right thing. So
I see the slides, but not in presentation mode.
right, exactly. Sorry about that. Let me just go back and apologies. Share screen. Share. Now you should be in presentation mode. Am I correct?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, great. So as Allison said, please use the Q&A during the talk to just drop questions in so that I can try and address them later. But I'll just jump right in now. So the videos that you watched, some of which were done by me and some by Dr. Ram Rajagopal at Stanford, who's a real expert in grid decarbonization, discussed the following 5 topics: the electric grid architecture and the challenge posed by integrating renewables into that and bringing the grid into the 21st century. And then he talked at length about the opportunities and challenges for integrating storage into the grid and flexibility of demand and electric vehicles. And I'm going to briefly go over the first 4 as sort of a summary of the things he talked about. And then I'm going to give you some examples with real world data from a very personal journey that I took on this decarbonization pathway to help illustrate some of the challenges that we were talking about. So let's start again with this framing diagram that's been in both sections of this series. And on what I'm showing you here are the sources of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere that are causing climate change. And what you can see in this diagram is that our production of energy writ large is about 75% of all the problem. That diagram then flows through to where this energy is being used. So in residential buildings, in commercial buildings, in agriculture, in road transportation, et cetera. And then out the right-hand side of the diagram tells you which greenhouse gas is being produced, and together those are causing climate change. The bottom line from this diagram for today's talk is that roughly a quarter of emissions come from electricity production. When I first recorded these videos, electricity was the biggest emitter. Of course, right after I recorded them, transportation came in slightly ahead of electricity in 2022, but it doesn't really matter for the talk because transportation will soon be part of the electricity sector as we electrify our vehicle fleet, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So electricity is a huge producer of greenhouse gases. And the reason for that is that we produce electricity mostly by burning coal and by burning natural gas. So fossil fuels make up roughly a little over 60% of the total electricity mix. And non-emitting sources, which include nuclear fission, which is very prominent in some countries and not in others, hydropower, wind, solar, and other renewables make up the other roughly third of electricity production. There are a couple other things I want to highlight about this image before I move on. The first is that in the year 2000, fossil fuels made up 64.8% of electricity production, and 23 years later, they make up 63.3%. So just over a 1.5% drop. Now, the total amount of electricity production has gone up. So renewables have really come on board in great numbers, but as a percentage, we're still using mostly 2/3 fossil fuels to generate our electricity. And so despite all the press about how fast renewables are coming online as a percentage, it really hasn't changed very much at all. If you look at low carbon sources, it's gone up 1.5%, essentially. That's in stark contrast to what we need to do in order to achieve in order to maintain a reasonable climate space. So you've often heard probably in the news, scientists say it's only safe to warm up 2 degrees Celsius, or scientists say it's only safe to warm up 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's a bit of a misconception. What we can do is we can estimate the damages associated with different temperature increases, and the damages increase exponentially as the temperature increases. So 1.5 is a much safer space than 2 degrees, but 2 degrees is also a much safer space than 2.5 degrees. So I do want to sort of step away from this, there's a cliff, and if we go over the cliff, science says that all will be lost. That's really not how science works. We can tell you how much warmer it will get for a certain amount of emissions. We can do that pretty well, and we can estimate the damages associated with those changes. But we can't say, okay, there's a line in the sand. Nonetheless, if your goal is to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, what has to happen? Well, in order to stay below 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise, we need to reduce our use of coal, oil, and gas in the electricity sector by about 70% in the next 7 years. And we need to grow the share of renewables by about 5, or non-emitting sources of electricity by about 5-fold in the next 7 years. So this is no small challenge, and one that we are racing to achieve, because 2 degrees, that trajectory towards 2 degrees Celsius is at the outer bounds of what is sort of readily imaginable in terms of a climate future. Anything more than that, any warming beyond that, really starts to become much more uncertain in terms of the impacts, because they grow so much bigger. And this was in the first series on climate science, but I want to bring it back here. Because the statements on the previous slide of how much electricity production can come from fossil fuel is grounded in this slide. So what I'm showing you in this slide on the y-axis is how much warmer it's going to get, or how much warmer it has gotten. The black line is showing you how the historical global warming trend. On the x-axis on the bottom is the total amount of carbon dioxide that we've emitted since 1850. And you can see there's a very linear connection between how much CO2 we emit and how much warmer it gets. The colored bands moving off to the right are showing you different scenarios that roughly correspond to how much warmer it's going to get. So the blue box tells you how much carbon we can emit and still stay below 2 degrees Celsius, roughly, of warming. And so what you see from that, if you follow the black squiggly line to the end, is that we don't have very much carbon left to spend. If we continue to emit at current rates for the next decade, 1.5 degrees Celsius will be in the rearview mirror, and 2 degrees Celsius will be very hard to stay below. This is important for electricity because even if we just run our current and planned electric facilities to the end of their planned lifetime, we will emit more CO2 than we can afford if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what I'm showing you here is a time series going out from 2018 out to 2070. The purple blob in there is showing you the total emissions expected to come from current electric plants worldwide. Okay, that's 358 tons. And then the purple band, not purple, but the light band on the outside called proposed, those are proposed electric projects that would emit together another 188. 358 plus 188 is more than 500 gigatons of CO2. And it's about 500 gigatons of CO2 that we have left in our carbon budget if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees C. So if we run existing and proposed electric facilities to the end of their lifetime, we will not stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That sort of emphasizes how radical a shift we need. I also pointed out in the intro video that there's another major challenge that we have, and that is actually increasing access to electricity. So this is a graph showing you over time between the year 2000 and 2019, the number of people in millions, so 1,000 is a billion, living without access to reliable electricity. And this is not all the time electricity. This is electricity sufficient to run a few light bulbs and maybe a fridge. And there are still almost 800 million people in the world who don't have access even to that level of electricity. So at the same time as we're trying to decarbonize the grid, we also need to increase the amount of electricity that we're producing if we hope to build an equitable future for all people on Earth, not just those who are wealthy enough or live in a country right now that have access to steady electricity. So for all of those reasons, zero emissions electricity is likely the single most important step we can take and that we need to take rapidly in the next several years, really. It's not decades anymore, it's several years. So the videos that you watched talked about the challenge of transitioning a grid like the US electric grid from the way it was to the way it needs to be. And so this diagram was embedded in those lectures, and it just shows the way the US grid is set up or was set up for the 20th century. On the left-hand side, you have a generator, so that's a power plant. There's a market system where that power plant can bid into a wholesale market and get that electricity transmitted. And then on the sort of closer to the customer, there's a utility that is managing the distribution from the big sort of substations down through those wires that are probably outside your house and then to your house. And that system is designed for one-way flow of power from point source generators like power plants to individual consumers. So you can think of it as sort of a radial network. You have a generator and then sort of spreading out to everybody in a single direction. And as Dr. Rajagopal talked about in his talks, that's got to change. That's going to change. So one of the things that's going to happen on the left-hand side of the diagram is that we continue to integrate more and more renewables like wind and solar and are beginning to integrate batteries into the transmission network. But of course, wind and solar, at least without batteries, don't produce when you want them to. They produce when the wind is blowing or when the sun is shining. So that poses a challenge of intermittency. And then on the consumer side, we actually are going to see a really big increase in electricity consumption. And I'll talk a lot about that in the last part of this talk as we introduce electric cars and other changes. But in addition to that, as people put solar panels on their houses, you have the ability to feed electricity back into the grid. And so instead of having one directional flow from a power plant to the house, now you have bidirectional flow, which both causes engineering challenges, but also market challenges to the utility and the generators who are trying to make money selling electricity. So Dr. Rajagopal talked a lot about that. And I just wanted to highlight that this 21st century grid is still evolving. Our idea of it is still evolving. For 70 years, we have invested very heavily in a stable, reliable grid that goes from power plants to houses. And in the next several years to decades, we need to completely rework that model into one where there's bidirectional flow of electricity, there's large penetration of intermittent sources, there's new kinds of storage, and increased electric demand. So it's a really big engineering challenge for sure. And some of the things that Dr. Rajagopal talked about, I'm not going to go into them in great detail, are things like how do we build stability in that grid against intermittency? How do we deal with the need to rapidly ramp up production as the sun goes down, for example? If you have huge amounts of solar power generated during the day, then power plants that are running on coal or natural gas might sit idle. But then as the sun goes down, they have to ramp up really, really fast. And that puts a lot of stress both on the power plants, but also on the grid infrastructure. And just to give you a sense of that, on the left-hand side of this diagram, I'm showing the power output from windmills and solar panels. And so if you look at the power output from windmills, or this, it is sort of this one example, but you can see that it's not a very smooth curve. And for solar panels, there's a very smooth curve shown in the blue bar over the course of the day. But then if clouds happen to come overhead, power drops dramatically and almost instantaneously, and then ramps back up almost instantaneously. And because in the current grid, there's no storage, supply has to perfectly match demand. This kind of intermittency really challenges the engineering of the grid. But so too does it challenge the business models and regulatory framework and pricing mechanisms that we've built around a different system. Here's another example. This is 30 days of climate data from the Bonneville Power Administration in the Northwest United States. First, I want you to look at the red lines. So the red lines, which show sort of a ramp up towards 8 a.m. and a ramp down towards 4 p.m., a little bump back up around in the evening and then down towards midnight. Those red lines over 30 days mark out the demand for electricity that people have as they go through their day-to-day activities. The blue shows you the production of wind power over that same 30 days. And you can see it's just spaghetti all over the map. Very, very, very hard to predict. On average, it produces a pretty consistent pattern, but we don't deal in 30-day averages with electricity consumption. We need to match production and consumption on a second-to-second basis. Solar, shown in yellow, is a little bit more consistent, right? It ramps up in the morning and is highest in the middle of the day and then ramps back down. But even there are small wiggles, right? And certainly no production at night, right? You can't get solar panels to produce at night. So these are some of the engineering challenges, I think, that are really that we're going to need to overcome as we push more and more renewables into the grid. It's not a problem if there's just one solar panel out there or one windmill. But when you have thousands and thousands and thousands making up more than 50% of the total power on the grid, managing this intermittency is a real challenge. Nonetheless, there are some groups who really believe that we can achieve a carbon-free, 100% renewable grid by 2050. So this is a paper that came out a few years ago by Mark Jacobson's group at Stanford in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they argued that the greatest concern facing large-scale integration of wind, water, and solar is the high cost of avoiding load loss that is caused by variability. Nonetheless, their model suggested that this could be done using no natural gas, no biofuels, no nuclear power, and no stationary batteries, and that it would cost less. Now, in response to that article, another group of scholars wrote a response, and their basic argument was, no, you're all wrong. In this paper, we find significant shortcomings, and we point to this work using invalid modeling tools, modeling errors, et cetera, and that policymakers should treat with caution any visions of rapid, reliable, low-cost transition to an entire energy system that relies almost exclusively on wind and solar. So you can see that the science is not yet sort of in. Nonetheless, the first group published a paper more recently in Joule, arguing that not only could we do this in the United States, but they mapped out a 100% clean and renewable wind and water and sunlight for all sectors of energy for 139 countries in the world. And they argued that that would create 52 million jobs, which is more than the jobs lost. And they chose to, in their example, they broke out how they were going to do it: residential rooftop solar plants, et cetera. I actually am not an expert enough in this area to take a side in this argument. And so I actually am going to go on in a slightly different way and argue that it doesn't really matter in the short term whether we can run off 100% renewables. It matters that we rapidly increase the amount of renewables on the grid to buy ourselves time to figure this out. I'm a great believer in human ingenuity. I think if we set our minds to it, we can figure out how to do this. We don't have to do it tomorrow. And remember, the amount of renewables as a percentage of electricity generation has gone up only by 1.5% since the year 2000. We can go a lot further than that before we have to worry about whether it's going to be 100% or 80% or 90%. And so for the rest of this time I have, which is about another 10 minutes, before I open it up to questions, I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to skip this slide actually, and I'm going to come to a point that I want to make for the last 10 minutes. And that is that in addition to the challenges of renewables, in addition to the challenge of grid storage, reducing emissions will require actually a massive increase in electricity use, paradoxically. And I want to walk you through some numbers as to why that's so, and give you a very personal example from my own life. So here in this graph, I'm showing you US emissions by the sector of the economy between 1990 and 2020. And you can see that transportation, electricity, and industry are the biggest, and then commercial and residential sectors are also a substantial contributor. That's mostly for heating of those spaces. So I want to give you an example from a residential sector, and instead of giving you more graphs about global or regional or anything like that, I'm going to give you a very concrete example of my own house. So welcome to my house. This is circa 2010, this picture. We moved in 2007. And if you take a thermal image of that, if you took a thermal image of that house, which we did, you'll see on a cold winter's day when we're running our heat inside, that there's a lot of heat leaking out. So everywhere you see red, that's heat leaking out the windows, leaking out the doors, leaking out the dormers on the top. And so we're paying money to heat the house, at this time paying with oil heat, which went to steam radiators, paying money to heat that house, emitting CO2 out the chimney, and leaking that out the windows and the walls. So we took upon ourselves to insulate. This is a picture of the attic that we renovated. You can see no insulation in the walls. And then what you can see in this picture is blown in foam insulation in the walls. And we insulated the house well enough on the outside and the inside so that we could take the next step, which was to actually eliminate oil combustion from our house altogether. So this is not a picture of my furnace because I forgot to take a picture of my furnace before we took it out. But this is kind of what it looked like: a box that burned stuff, a hot water tank that fed off of that, and the furnace then fed steam to radiators in the rest of the house. This is what it looks like now. I'm showing you an empty corner of where the oil tank, the 250-gallon oil tank, used to be, and over by the yoga mat that's purple, that's where the furnace used to be. We replaced them with something called heat pumps. So these are air conditioners that essentially can provide heat in the winter while they provide cooling in the summer. These are the outside units. And this is the inside unit. For those of you in Europe, or actually pretty much anywhere else in the world besides the United States, these are very common, and you see them all over the place. They're still catching on here, although heat pumps outsold furnaces in the US for the first time in 2022. And a heat pump works by moving heat rather than making heat. And you have one in your house for sure. That's how a refrigerator works. So this is a picture of a cartoon of a refrigerator. Refrigerator has a coil in it. It has a refrigerant in that coil that absorbs heat from the air inside the fridge. A pump moves that refrigerant out. Electricity runs a compressor, and it dumps that heat out into your kitchen, where your cat is curled up nice and warm right in front of the fridge. My heat pump that heats my house, or if you have one that heats your house, does the exact same thing, just in the opposite direction. So instead of taking heat from the cold fridge and making it a little colder and making the kitchen warmer, it's taking heat from the outdoor air, making the outdoor air a little colder, moving that into the house and making your house warmer. And so the bottom line here is that you have a compressor outside, you have a vent inside, and you're using electricity to move heat from one place to the other. We also replaced our hot water heater with a heat pump, and we switched to an induction burner. I'm not going to talk a lot about that in the interest of time, but let's now see how our post-renovation house does from a climate perspective. So on the left is the old house, on the right is the new house. We were burning about 866 gallons of oil per year to heat the house. Of course, we're not burning any oil anymore. We've ripped out our furnace. We were using about 3,400 kilowatt hours of electricity per year to run our fridge, to run our lights, to run our TV, to run dehumidifier in the basement, whatever. And of course, because we switched from oil to electric heat pumps, our electricity use went up. Okay, so you can see a roughly threefold increase in our electricity use. But now let's look at the emissions from the house. So when we had oil and electric, we were emitting close to 10 tons of CO2 per year. And our all-electric heat pump system is emitting closer to 2.3. If we had had natural gas, it would have been intermediate, but still all electric heat pumps are way better. And so that's a 75% reduction in our emissions, even as we have increased our electricity use. So reducing emissions will require electricity use to rise. I'm going to give you a second example from the transportation sector, again, a personal example. This is my neighbor's car. I took this picture the other day. I'll have a joke we share a driveway with our neighbor, and we have a joke that you can only own blue cars because none of us have ever had anything but a blue car. Anyway, this is my neighbor's car. This is our car, also blue, radically lighter blue. But our car is very different than their car. And it's shown here in this picture because instead of a gas tank, we have a plug. So instead of a gas-powered car, we switched in 2019 to an all-electric vehicle. So let's look then at the implications of that choice. A gas car, on average, in the US, gets about 25 miles per gallon. We were driving, between my wife and I, about 15,000 miles per year. So that's 600 gallons of gasoline per year. So that was about 5.3 metric tons of CO2. An electric car, but in general, gets about 4 miles per kilowatt hour. That's been our experience over the course of 2 now full years. So keeping the same 15,000 miles per year, that's 3,700 kilowatt hours. And if you calculate how much emissions it takes at the power plant to produce that amount of electricity, it's a little less than 1 ton a year of emissions. So that's even counting the power plant emissions. There's of course no emissions that are coming out of the tailpipe of an electric car because there is no tailpipe. So now let's do a full comparison of the house with the cars. 866 gallons of oil to no gallons of oil. 600 gallons of gasoline per year to no gallons of gasoline per year. 3,400 kilowatt hours a year bumped up to 13,000 kilowatt hours per year. So way more electricity, not surprisingly, but emissions dropping by almost 80%. And so the bottom line here is we have increased our electricity use by roughly 400%, but we've decreased our emissions by 80%. The point I want to make here is that while we figure out the engineering of how to transition the electricity grid from what it was to what it is, or what it's going to be, with deep penetration of renewables, with electric cars, with increases of demand, all of those things that we're working really hard as a society to build out and to figure out, we don't have to wait. We can make changes right now that will reduce our emissions dramatically. In our case of our house and our car, almost 80%, right? While we figure out how to run our grid off renewables. We don't need the answer to that question instantly. We can make an enormous amount of progress in many sectors, not just home heating and transportation. And that is the transition we also need to start right now. That doesn't mean that we're off the hook. We still need to transition to renewables. We still need that rapid build out, but there's a lot we can do other than that. And I would encourage you, as you think about your own footprint and your own neighborhood and your own neighbors and your own family, to think about the things that you can do. And the 2 most important things you can do are electrify and then electrify. And then the 3rd most important thing is electrify. And after that, we can continue the conversation about the transition to 100% renewables and how quickly that can get done. So I think I'll stop there with the presentation. I hope that I see there's a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so that's great. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to let Allison moderate the questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. You are right. We have a ton of questions, and it's all because of what an engaging presentation you put together today. So thank you for that. And we had a couple that came in advance. So I want to start with at least a few of those. So thank you for sending these questions in advance. And then we'll get to as many of these questions as we can as well. So the first question is, what are the environmental and social impacts of lithium mining?
Sure. So this has been in the news a lot, particularly mining in Congo has been highlighted as having particularly, although that's actually for cobalt, not for lithium. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry, was the question about lithium or just batteries in general?
They were asking about lithium specifically, but I wonder if it wouldn't be connected to batteries. So I bet this is, I bet
so
this is related.
So there's been a lot of talk about how energy intensive and how human rights problematic, I guess is a poor way of saying it. Mining for cobalt is, which is a component of lithium ion batteries, and then more generally, how damaging mining for lithium is. They're sort of two separate things, and I'm going to talk about cobalt first. So it is clear that environmental and human health violations associated with mining in countries that do not have strict regulations can be horrific, and Congo is certainly an example of that. In response to that, many companies are already switching away from cobalt as an additive to their lithium batteries to other things, specifically for that reason. I would also point out that mining and drilling for oil and other things is always bad in countries that don't have environmental regulations. So diamond mining is horrific in much of the world. Gold mining is horrific in much of the world. And so I think that's a much bigger question about, like, how do we enforce human rights and environmental regulations globally for the materials that we source? For lithium in particular, we're going to be using lithium for a while. There's quite a lot of lithium available. And so, yes, we should mine it in a way that's as environmentally responsible as possible and also ensure that human rights are not violated, of course. But I don't see that as a reason to not use this technology. All materials that we gather from the environment by mining are sort of in the same realm of those problems. The other thing I would say on this front is that there is no free lunch. There are soon to be 10 billion of us who use an enormous amount of energy, and there's no way to gather that energy without there being impacts on the planet. But the impacts of switching to electric vehicles in particular are so much lower than the impacts that will, both human and environmental impacts that will come with really unmitigated climate change, that it's a false dichotomy to say, you know, well, lithium mining is bad, therefore we shouldn't decarbonize, because the alternative is to continue to use fossil fuels, which is worse than the lithium mining. So I think it's really important. We're used to the human, not used to, but we've grown numb to the incredible human impacts, health impacts, equity impacts associated with our current system of fossil fuel combustion. And so when we think about transitioning to something else, we think, oh, those are bad. Yeah, they may be, and we should make them as good as we can, but we can't compare them to a utopia. We have to compare them to the world that we're actually living in now. And the unmitigated climate change will cause enormous hardship on the poorest, most vulnerable people in the world, more than it will on the wealthy. And so I think if you're looking at an equity perspective, you have to think about both sides of that very real compromise.
Thank you so much. And there are a couple of related questions to the question about equity and also kind of human capacity for change. And so I want to ask those next. One question is, what solutions can those of us who are living in big cities like New York take upon ourselves when we're living in apartments whose resources building wide are not changing?
Yeah, so I grew up in New York City, so hi. It will depend a lot on what sort of structure you're living in. So, you know, co-ops are a particularly hard thing in New York, but I'll just speak generally about cities, okay? So urban dwellers tend to have lower emissions, but nonetheless, cities are beginning to impose carbon taxes. New York is actually really ahead of the game on this. And so it is possible to start transitioning to heat pumps even in cities. if you live in New York or another big urban environment, you might not own a car. So that's a big thing. And so probably one of the biggest pieces of your footprint is going to be your transportation, like flying. Your red meat consumption will also be something that you could personally do because red meat and dairy have a very big carbon footprint. And then also be really cautious about the place you source your materials. So try not to buy tropical hardwoods, for example, or other things that come from tropical deforestation. That's another big source of emissions. We'll talk about that the next one. And then lastly, if on your energy bill, you have the option for selecting renewable electricity, and that will again depend on your particular who pays your bill, like in co-ops, you don't, anyway, select that. Those are the things you can do. And then lobby your board and vote for more renewable energy and less fossil combustion.
Thank you. That's great. A similar question around kind of human change is a question that says there's often a belief that there needs to be significant behavioral change to address climate change, that we need to turn down our heat or AC, use electricity, et cetera. But human behavioral change is really hard. Are there known and financially viable alternative technologies that would allow humans to continue consumption at the same rate while simultaneously reducing emissions enough to mitigate or reverse the climate change path that we are on?
Yeah, so I mean, I just gave you two examples of a transition that reduced my emissions by 80% and actually changed my life for the better at lower cost. So my house is more comfortable than it was. My car drives way better than a gas car. And my emissions are 80% less than they were from those two sectors. So there's a lot of innovation. We don't need to sit in the dark to make this transition. I think if we ask people to sit in the dark to make this transition, it will fail and we won't. Do we know how to do it perfectly so that the whole world can consume at US rates? No, we definitely don't know how to do that. But it doesn't have to happen instantaneously. And for example, I think, there are real examples that matter. So for example, we switched from incandescent light bulbs to LED light bulbs that reduced consumption by 90% and it doesn't look any different, right? My car drives better and it's 90% or 70% fewer emissions than a gas car. My house feels more comfortable. So these are there. We don't have to be as wasteful in order to enjoy. What we want is the benefits of energy. We don't want to waste energy. Right? It's not useful to us to put CO2 into the environment. It's useful to us to extract energy and use that for stuff. I firmly believe that we can get there. The transition is going to be messy, but at the same time, that's not a reason to delay. It's a reason to act as quickly as possible. And we are going to have to figure this out on the way. But the first part of that journey is definitely doable and will not cause those of us with very high CO2 lifestyles like people in the United States. It doesn't have to mean that we sit in the dark.
Thank you. We have two questions about microgrids I'm going to combine into one. The first question is, what's stopping us from moving away from the traditional utility model and towards microgrids? And the second question is, what is the feasible size of a microgrid that would really work and be able to give us the power that we need?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I'm not a grid engineer, and so I'm not an expert in microgrids, and so I'll maybe just answer that very briefly because it's not really the place that I'm the most expert. For those of you who don't know, a microgrid just means what it sounds like, a small area that has its own generation and storage. And so at the very smallest, an individual house that has solar power and batteries and no connection to the grid, an off the grid house, that's its own little microgrid, right? And the problem with that is if the batteries don't work, or if the sun doesn't shine for a really long time, or even a short amount of time, then you can't run your house. And so over the course of the 20th century, we built out an interconnected grid that is not one grid all over the world. In the US, there are multiple grids that are sort of loosely tied to each other, but they're not at the scale of a house or even a city or even a state, except for Texas, which has its own grid. They're at the scale of a region. And that has the benefit of having multiple sources of power generation and multiple redundancies. So if there's a big problem in one place, there's still power available. For example, if a power plant shuts down because of a mechanical problem, if you only have one power plant, then you're out of power. But if you have 100 power plants, the other 99 can ramp up and fill in for the one that went down because of a mechanical problem, which happens all the time. So what is the ideal size for a microgrid really is a question that depends on what you're hoping to get out of your microgrid. If you're really hoping to run 24/7, nope, and have lots of redundancy. So for example, here at Brown, we worry a lot about a system that's 100% electric because we only have one really big feeder coming into the whole campus. And if that feeder goes down and we're 100% electric, what do we do about our resiliency and all the students that are on campus and our need to continue operations? And so as we decarbonize, and I think in the chat that there was is Brown doing anything? I'm happy to answer that question as well. We have to think both about resiliency and about decarbonization at the same time, and that's a challenge. That's where I'm going to leave microgrids, just because it's not my super area of expertise.
Thank you. And yeah, let's go ahead and move into that question then. Is Brown University moving away from fossil fuels and its investments and endowment and moving to clean renewable investments and doing anything around batteries and storage?
Yeah. So Brown is basically completely divested from fossil fuels. There, to my understanding, and I haven't had an update in a little while, but there were a few old investments that couldn't be sold for a certain amount of time. And so, but they're less than they're a very small fraction of the portfolio, and their plan is to sell them. We are actually rapidly moving to eliminate fossil combustion from campus. So we have about 250 buildings. It's about 7 million square feet. And by 2040, we will have no more fossil combustion on campus. By 2025, we'll have reduced our emissions by 75% through a combination of solar panels in southern Rhode Island, and windmills, which will produce 100% of our electricity, at least on an annual basis. In terms of batteries, we are really monitoring the battery technology, but it's not there yet for what we're going to need, which is bridging from summer to winter. And so we're actually going to be, I think, we're still doing the engineering, but I think we're actually going to be using the earth as a thermal battery. And so the idea there is that we will drill a bunch of geothermal wells. In the summertime, when we're running air conditioning off of renewable electricity, those air conditioners will be rejecting heat somewhere. Instead of dumping it into the outside air, we're going to dump that heat underground, warm up the rock, and then pull that heat back in the winter to heat our building. So that's using a different kind of heat pump. The heat pump I talked about in my house is using air as the source of heat. This would just be using the earth as a source of heat. So that's a heat pump that's moving heat from the earth to the buildings. And then in the summer, we will dump heat back down there to sort of as a thermal battery. So yes, Brown is doing a lot on this front. And we are hoping that others follow our example. We're working with the city and state to try and think about these solutions at a broader scale. And we're also working with our peer institutions, many of whom are beginning or are doing similar things in different settings with different challenges. So we're sharing information as fast as we can to try and get us all over this threshold of eliminating fossil combustion as quickly as possible. In Brown's case, it will be by 2040 at the latest.
Thank you. Another question is, how do we balance using fossil fuels to build renewables on the scale that we need with our need to combat climate change now and reduce fossil fuel usage? Yeah, so my answer to that is it doesn't matter what you use to build your renewables, because the renewables are so much of a benefit. So it would be, of course, ideal, and soon we will build enough renewables to power our factories with renewables and then make more renewables. But in the short term, we need to use fossil fuels. And I'll actually turn to the example of electric cars for this reason. So you might have seen in the news that, the battery associated with the electric car makes the emissions associated with the construction of the car higher than if it were a gas car. So, and that's basically true, although, but then if you look over the life of the car, say even a couple of years, even in just a couple of years, the extra emissions associated with the battery have been made up for by the more efficient electric car. And over the lifetime of the car, the emissions of the car are way, way, way lower, even if you include the construction of the battery, even though the battery is likely being built using electricity that was generated by coal. So is it ideal? No, of course, I would much rather that everything we build, from buildings to pencils to I don't know, this shirt, are all produced with electricity that is made from renewables. We're not there yet, but that shouldn't slow us down, because the emissions associated with the creation of a solar panel are teeny compared to the emissions saved by the operation of the solar panel over the next 25 years as it sits in the sun. Thank you. That's really helpful. We have another two questions that are somewhat similar that I'm going to combine into one. It says, you've spoken about how a multidisciplinary approach is needed, and do you see the private or public sector playing a larger role in funding the transition to zero emissions electricity? And then the second question is, can you comment on how big a role regulatory barriers are playing right now in our transition to renewables?
Sure. I'm actually going to defer as a pitch for our next talk on deforestation. I'm going to talk a lot about public and private investment from the standpoint of reducing emissions from deforestation. And I think that's actually a place where that conversation, electric utilities are they're very heavily regulated. They're monopolies or quasi-monopolies. And so the private sector can certainly play a role in innovation for sure. And it plays a critical role in innovation, both in energy management. Google and GE and many others are looking at building algorithms that can help us decarbonize. And so there's a lot of work to be done by the private sector on that front. But I think I'll defer. And then I'm sorry, the second question was the role of regulation.
Yes, and whether it is kind of helping or harming the transition to renewables and their access to the grid too.
Yeah, so that's a great question. This is again something that Brown has struggled with. So public utilities commissions often stand between the utility and the consumer in the United States. So they set because it's a monopoly, essentially, the Public Utilities Commission sets the rates that consumers pay, and they have to approve all new generation. And they are really not staffed or equipped to deal with the influx of renewable requests. Here in Rhode Island, Brown signed a contract to take electricity from a very, very large solar field in southern Rhode Island. The field was built, the contracts were signed, and we have been waiting for sort of a series of regulatory hurdles to resolve themselves now for almost 2 years, where one thing comes up and the next thing comes up and the next thing comes up, and all of that is because my own personal feeling is much of that is because this is the first really, really big solar project to go through the pipeline. So it's probably a bad word, go through the wires. And so, agencies that have been tasked with doing business a certain way for a very long time are now being asked to think about an entirely different problem. And similarly, they are responsible, or in addition, they are responsible for ensuring consistent power, and people get really upset when their power goes out for even a few seconds and certainly for a day. And so they have to deal with these intermittent sources and how they come in and how they manage it. And so, but they're also going to get yelled at if anything goes wrong. And so that regulatory framework is slow to change, and it has to change more quickly. I think actually, in my own opinion, it's regulation that is slowing the transition to renewables far more than it is technology. So if we could figure out how to build transmission lines from places that have high renewables to places that are consuming a lot of electricity, if we could do that efficiently, if we could get offshore wind going without endless fights about I don't like the view, or misinformation campaigns about how a dead whale that washes up in New Jersey is the fault of the offshore wind industry, or all this stuff. If we could actually get this out there, it's not the technology right now that's slowing us down. But at the same time, it's important to have thoughtful deliberation and scientific guidance and public input on big changes in infrastructure. So as a democracy, we're trying to balance how those two things go together. Unfortunately, the biophysical system, the Earth system, doesn't care at all about our political squabbles or whether we like the view or whether we don't like the view. The climate system responds to the amount of CO2 in the air, and that's going up and up and up and up as a result of the way we're doing business now. And so it's sort of agnostic, right? It doesn't care whose fault it is. And I've made this point in earlier videos. It cares only how much CO2 there is in the air. And that's sort of the hard biophysical limit that our political machinations are going to run up against.
Thank you. I think we have time for just two more questions. So the first of the two I'm going to ask you along the same lines of barriers is, to what extent is it a barrier that we don't have enough trained service technicians capable of working on these new technologies? And this person specifically mentioned heat pumps, but I think that's also probably broader as well.
That's a really excellent point. So we have a enormous gap, at least here in Rhode Island and in the Northeast, of heat pump technicians in particular. So most HVAC contractors are trained to come out and say, here's your air conditioner, it'll work in the summer, and here's your furnace, it'll work in the winter. And if your furnace goes out, they replace it with a furnace. Oftentimes, the people who come check your furnace are the people who are selling you oil or selling you gas. And so they don't have a big incentive to sell you something different. So it's a really important point. And one of the things that I hope we see is as we switch is a boom in jobs in this area. This is, we're going to need to get rid of every furnace in this country in the next 25 years. And if we're going to do that, we need a lot of people who can come out, not only do the heat pump installation, but assess how many heat pumps and where those heat pumps need to be in order to heat your particular house. And that's a hard thing to do, especially for a house that's old and might be, cobbled together, multiple phases of construction. For new houses, here in Rhode Island, at least, most new houses are being built with heat pumps because they're so much more efficient and it's so much easier. It saves the homeowner money. You don't need duct work. Like it's much, so heat pumps are great for new construction. They're basically at cost parity, but for old houses that we do need more technicians. That's a big challenge.
Thank you. And I thought this would be a fun one to kind of end the Q&A section on, which is, what will the future of electricity and renewable energy look like for the rest of the world by the year 2050?
That's a great question. So I don't have a crystal ball that goes out that far, but I will say that a couple things. One, solar is already the cheapest electricity in the world in almost every market. So that's an enormous transition that's happened over the past decade, really. Solar plus batteries are coming to cost parity in many markets. And I would imagine in the next decade will be by far the cheapest full-time reliable source of power. I hope to see a massive increase in electricity production, particularly in places that do not have access to electricity, because it's a basic human right to have lights and healthcare and education, all of which flow from electricity consumption. At the same time, I hope to see those produced by wind and solar and batteries, and hopefully in the second half of this century by fusion. Now, we haven't talked a lot about nuclear fission or fusion in this lecture, but there is great hope, although it is still just a hope, that in the second half of this century, we may see the onboarding of fusion technology that both does not produce a lot of radioactive waste, but also produces unimaginable amounts of energy. I will temper that optimism with the comment that has been said before and has not come to fruition. But I think if we put our minds to it, this is a transition we can make. We can do this. I think if you had asked me 15 years ago if the technology was ready, I would have said no. If you ask me now, I would say it's about half ready, but we can get that first half going and figure out the rest. And I'm much more optimistic now than I was a decade ago that we can actually make this transition. We will continue to heat the planet and the planet will continue to warm. But I do believe that if we put our minds to it, we can avert the worst consequences. And that's what we all need to dedicate. Well, that's what I dedicate myself to every day. And I encourage you to think how you can contribute to that conversation.
Thank you so much. That is such a wonderful, optimistic, and specific note to end on. And one thing I would love to encourage everyone here to do is, if you've been inspired to take a different action, a specific action at the individual level, or some people were asking questions about advocating for policy change, please type into the chat bar what action you are committing to take. And I would love to just kind of end by seeing this cascade of all of the change we're going to make as a group. And as you're typing this in, I'll close us out by thanking you so much, Stephen, for your incredible presentation today and for the way that you consistently take material that feels really dense and inaccessible to a lot of us, and myself in that camp, and make it really accessible, clear, and actionable. I think that's something that I really appreciate about this series. And I hope that all of you will, in addition to taking the action that you are going to share with us in the chat, I hope you will also join us for part 3 of this series, which will be on May 9th. We will start sending out invitations to that very shortly. So keep an eye out in your inbox for that. That one is on deforestation, and it also looks at the policy level, which is something that a lot of you expressed interest in, and looks at what they're doing in Brazil around deforestation as a case study to kind of look at what policy can do to advance our agenda of a better, more sustainable future. So we hope that you will join us on May 9th. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come and learn about this and commit to action, because it really will take all of us in order to create the future we want to see. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.